There's a town in America that doesn't exist, and somewhere around 30 million people used to visit it every week. It sits somewhere in the continental United States, near a mountain range, or near a coast, or near a desert, possibly near all three at once. And it has a nuclear power plant, a lemon tree, a monorail that doesn't work anymore, a tavern where the same four men have been sitting on the same stool since the first episode, and a family who live at 742 Evergreen Terrace and have not aged a single day since December of 1989. The Simpsons has been running for a very long time. Longer at this point than most of its original viewers have been adults. It has produced over 780 episodes across 36 seasons. It has been watched in more than 60 countries. It holds the record for longest-running American scripted primetime television series, a record it has held since 1997 and shows no particular interest in relinquishing. And yet almost nobody talks seriously about how deliberately it was built. That's the thing I keep coming back to. You start watching what presents itself as a cheerful cartoon about a bumbling father and his long-suffering family. And somewhere around the third or fourth season, something shifts in how you're watching it. The show starts to seem not accidentally clever, not lucky, but actually planned. Not in a rigid, mechanical way. More in the way that a place you know very well slowly reveals that somebody spent considerable time thinking about where to put things and why. And what would happen years later when you noticed. Some of the theories we're going to go through tonight are well known. The Springfield geography debate is practically a sport at this point. The Homer intelligence theory has its own small literary tradition. Others are a bit less discussed. The treehouse of horror as emotional safety valve. The way Moe's Tavern functions as the show's confessional. The slow accumulation of evidence that the writers have been saying goodbye since season 9 and just haven't finished. Tonight we're going to move through all of this slowly. That's the only way to do it properly. This kind of thing rewards a certain pace, the pace you're at when it's late and you're comfortable and you're half in the show and half somewhere else. The Simpsons was always built for exactly that kind of attention. And talking a bit about why this particular show rewards that kind of attention, it has generated entire careers, not just for its writers and voice actors, but for the fan theorists, the episode analysts, the academics who have written about it seriously, and there are quite a few. The podcasters who have been dissecting it for years. It has been studied as a satire of capitalism, as a portrait of working-class American life, as a meditation on suburban alienation, as a sustained experiment in what long-form serial comedy can sustain. All of those readings have merit. None of them are wrong. What I'm interested in tonight is something slightly different. Less the academic readings and more the specific details, the episodes, the choices, the moments where the show did something so precisely right that you have to believe someone intended it. The architecture underneath the yellow cartoon surface. If you'd like to be around for more of this, subscribing would be lovely. Right then, let's start where all good theories about Springfield start. With a place that doesn't technically exist on any map, and with a question that's been going since the show's first season without a definitive answer. There are 34 Springfields in the United States, not 34 towns with spring in the name. 34 towns called Springfield, distributed across the country in states ranging from Oregon to Florida to Illinois to Virginia. It is the single most common city name in America, and Matt Groening, the man who created The Simpsons, named his fictional hometown Springfield on purpose, for precisely this reason. That detail has been public since the early 90s. Groening has talked about it in interviews going back to the show's first years. The name was chosen because of its universality. Springfield is nowhere in particular, which is exactly why it can be everywhere at once. And once you understand that this choice was conscious and deliberate, not a coincidence, not a leftover from some earlier draft, but a specific philosophical position the show's creators chose and then maintained, you start to see the whole geographic mystery of the show differently. The question that fans have been asking since roughly 1990, what state is Springfield in, turns out to be the wrong question entirely. Let me build this out, because I think the full picture has more to it than it first appears. Groening grew up on Evergreen Terrace in Portland, Oregon. That's real. The street exists. The Pacific Northwest atmosphere of some early episodes, the overcast skies, the certain quality of suburban near wilderness, is real. and Groening has acknowledged it. In 2012, he told Smithsonian Magazine that Springfield was indeed based on Springfield, Oregon, a small city just south of Eugene. He confirmed it with what sounded like finality. The internet celebrated, case closed, except the show had been systematically contradicting the Oregon reading for over 20 years before that interview, and it continued contradicting it afterward. The 2012 statement was, in retrospect, Groening talking about the inspiration for the name, not the location of the show. There has been, for a very long time, an unofficial policy in the Simpsons writers' room. Not a formal rule, but an understood tradition. That whenever a script gets too geographically specific, the next writer is quietly encouraged to introduce a detail that breaks the pattern. Writers have mentioned it in commentary tracks over the years. Not a formal policy, just something the room understood, not maliciously, not to confuse anyone, just to preserve something the creators cared about preserving. The sense that Springfield belongs to everyone, not to any particular region. Think about what this required in practice. Across hundreds of episodes, dozens of writers, multiple showrunners, and thousands of individual scenes, someone had to keep saying, not too specific. Keep it vague. Every time a location was about to be pinned down, someone pulled it back. That is not an accident of production. That is a policy maintained with genuine commitment over decades. The geography itself is, if you look at it carefully, physically impossible for a single real location. Hurricane Nettie, Season 8, Episode 8, places Springfield in a region that experiences hurricanes, suggesting the Gulf Coast or the Southeast. Bart on the Road, Season 7, Episode 20, has the kids drive to Tennessee without crossing any apparent state border, implying Springfield is somewhere in the Mid-South or Southeast. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson, Season 9, Episode 1, treats New York as a distant, significant journey ruling out the Northeast. The climate episodes include heavy blizzards, scorching deserts, a beachfront, and mountains within apparent driving distance of the same suburb. This is a town that has everything, not because the writers were sloppy, because they were deliberate. 22 short films about Springfield. Season 7, Episode 21, April 14th, 1996, is probably the single episode that best demonstrates what the creators were building. The episode breaks the standard format entirely. Instead of following The Simpsons, it follows 12 different Springfield residents through overlapping short stories on the same afternoon. Apu has an entire relationship with his job that has nothing to do with the family. Chief Wiggum has a dynamic with his officers that operates independently. Skinner has a history with his mother, Professor Frink, Barney Gumble, even Hans Moleman. All of them have textured, coherent lives. The episode was the writer's demonstration that Springfield had outgrown its status as a backdrop for the Simpson family. It had become a community. A community has rhythms, relationships, recurring arguments, collective memory, shared jokes, local mythology. Springfield had all of that by Season 7. And communities don't have precise coordinates. They have a feel, a texture, a set of people you know and places you recognize. Here's a detail I find particularly interesting. The word ambigens, introduced in Lisa the Iconoclast, Season 7, Episode 16, as a word supposedly coined by Springfield's founder, was added to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary in 2018. A word the writers invented for a fictional town has become a real English word. That's not a theory about the show's geography. It's evidence of how completely Springfield has escaped its cartoon origins and become something that functions in the real world. Ambigens, it means to make larger or to ennoble. Springfield invented that. The 2012 Smithsonian Magazine quote is worth returning to one more time, because I think the distinction I drew earlier between the inspiration for the name and the location of the show is actually more interesting than it sounds. Groening confirmed that the name came from his childhood associations with Springfield, Oregon. He grew up knowing that name, he used it. But the show he built around that name is not set in Oregon or anywhere else. It is set in a kind of concentrated extract of American life that doesn't belong to any particular region. That's the creative move. Take a name that belongs everywhere, build a town that could be anywhere, populate it with types that every viewer recognizes, and then never pin it down. every viewer fills in the geography with their own town. The mountains are whatever mountains you know. The beach is whichever beach you grew up near. The nuclear plant is whatever industrial building shaped your childhood horizon. The writers chose the most common city name in America. They built a town with every American feature. They maintained the ambiguity across the show's entire run. This was not laziness. It was an act of extraordinary creative generosity. Springfield is yours. That's why it exists. And talking a bit more about the geography debate, there's something lovely about the fact that it's been going for as long as the show has been on air. It's one of the oldest ongoing fan conversations in television history. People have built elaborate cases using topographic clues, climate data, episode-specific road distances. There's a whole genre of fan analysis that maps every geographic reference across all 35-plus seasons and tries to triangulate a plausible location. The results are contradictory and wonderful, and ultimately inconclusive. This is exactly what the creators wanted. Not just ambiguity, but productive ambiguity. The kind that generates engagement rather than frustration. The show gives you enough specificity to feel like the answer exists, and withholds just enough to make sure you never quite find it. That balance is difficult to maintain. The Simpsons has maintained it for longer than most television series have existed. I sometimes think about what would have happened if the show had picked a state in season 1 and stuck with it. Oregon? Say, the show would have been the same in most respects. The jokes would have been the same. The characters would have been the same, but the audience relationship would have been different. There would always have been a group of viewers for whom Springfield wasn't theirs. For whom it was that Oregon family, those Pacific Northwest people, not the American family that belongs to everyone. The vagueness is worth something real. The show's geographic policy also does something interesting to its satire. If Springfield were in Oregon, the jokes about industrial pollution would be jokes about Oregon. If it were in Florida, the jokes about local politics would be Florida jokes. But Springfield is nowhere in particular, which means the jokes about nuclear power and corrupt mayors and failing public services and the particular combination of optimism and dysfunction that defines American civic life belong to everywhere. Every viewer is implicated. No viewer can point at a specific region and say, that's not us, that's them. It's all of us. That's the geometry of the satire, and it only works if the location stays unfixed. Here's something else I want to flag, which is the show's relationship with its own Springfield tourism. The Universal Studios theme park built a Springfield, USA area. It opened around 2013, and the choice of what to put in it is revealing. Krusty Burger, Moe's Tavern, Lard Lad Donuts, the Quick E-Mart. None of these are geographically specific places. They're types of places that exist everywhere in America. The diner, the bar, the donut shop, the convenience store. The theme park Springfield is a concentrated version of the cartoon Springfield's own logic. You build the types, not the specifics, and people recognize themselves. There's one more detail I want to return to before we move on, which is the Groening Street name. He grew up on Evergreen Terrace in Portland. The Simpsons live on Evergreen Terrace in Springfield. That's the one biographical tether he's confirmed and never walked back. Not the state, not the region, not the city, just the street. A single residential street, named after a specific street in a specific city, placed in a town that belongs to everyone. That seems exactly right, as a creative decision. The personal detail is there. The thing that came from a real place, a real childhood, a real memory. And then everything else is built to be universally accessible. Evergreen Terrace belongs to Groening's Portland, but Springfield belongs to wherever you grew up. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Here's something that changes the shape of the entire show if you let it settle properly. Homer Simpson is not stupid. Or rather, Homer Simpson was not born stupid, did not grow up stupid, and was not intended to be stupid. He became stupid at some point in childhood when a crayon lodged itself in his nasal passage and punctured the frontal lobe of his brain. He has been living with that injury, without knowing about it, for his entire adult life. And what this theory does, if you accept it, and I think you should, is transform the entire arc of the show from a comedy about an incompetent man into something considerably more layered. The Simpsons confirmed this in Season 12, Episode 9, HOMR, which aired on January 7, 2001. Homer accidentally discovers the crayon in an X-ray. He has it removed by a back alley surgeon, and his IQ immediately rises to 105. Not genius level, not unusually gifted, just competent, functioning, present. He starts reading, he forms opinions. He and Lisa have conversations of actual intellectual depth, the kind that neither of them has ever been able to have before. He notices things about the world around him that he'd been walking past his whole life. The episode is exceptional, but what I want to focus on is not the episode itself. It's what the episode does to everything that came before it. Because the early seasons of The Simpsons feature a version of Homer that is meaningfully different from the Homer of, say, seasons 9 through 12. This is not controversial. The show's critics and its fans have been discussing what they often call the jerk-ass Homer shift for years. The gradual drift from a Homer who was limited but emotionally real toward a Homer who was simply chaotic. The common explanation is tonal drift. More writers, more gag pressure, less continuity, character flattening. And that's probably partly true. But the crayon theory provides a different account of that drift. One that, whether intentional or not, makes the whole arc feel more meaningful than it would if it were just a production failure. Let me give you the evidence from the early episodes, because I think this is where the theory becomes genuinely interesting. Season 1's Bart the Genius, the second episode ever, broadcast January 14th, 1990, has Homer helping Bart study for an IQ test. He doesn't do this particularly well. He can't answer most of the questions, but he's engaged, he's patient. He wants Bart to succeed, and that desire is legible as a real adult human feeling rather than a joke about incompetence. There's an emotional intelligence to how he reads the room, even when the academic content is beyond him. That Homer, trying, present, genuinely there, is not a buffoon. Season 3's Homer at the Bat, one of the great episodes in the show's history, broadcast February 20th, 1992, has Homer debating baseball history with accuracy and confidence. He knows who Roger Clemens is. He can distinguish between players and cite their records. He sustains a factual argument and wins it. A genuinely incapable man doesn't do this. Season 4's Marge vs. the Monorail, written by a young Conan O'Brien, considered one of the best episodes ever produced, has Homer ultimately figure out how to stop a runaway monorail by improvising an anchor from miscellaneous items inside the train. The solution is creative and lateral, and it works. You don't arrive at that solution by accident. You arrive there by being, in some meaningful sense, capable of problem solving. And there are the moments of tenderness, the scenes where Homer's love for his family is expressed with a precision that genuine stupidity couldn't generate. The story he tells in And Maggie Makes 3 about why he keeps going to a job he hates. The note he writes Lisa at the end of HOMR, the moment in Lisa's Substitute, Season 2, Episode 19, where Homer reads the note Lisa left him when she was angry at him, and his response is to keep the note in his pocket and say nothing about it to anyone. The crayon theory holds that all of these moments, the baseball knowledge, the monorail solution, the private tenderness, are the real Homer, present despite the injury. The things he doesn't understand, the spectacular misjudgments, the narrowing of attention that gets more pronounced in later seasons. Those are the injury progressing, or deepening, or simply being more fully expressed as the character gets pushed further from his original conception. HOMR is the moment when the show acknowledged this directly. And the ending of the episode is the part I find genuinely difficult to get past in the best possible way. Homer without the crayon is smarter. He is also lonelier. He can see things he couldn't see before, and not all of them are pleasant. He sees the mediocrity of his work. He understands the social gulf between himself and Marge's friends and colleagues. He can hold a conversation with Lisa about a film they both watched, and it's the warmest extended conversation those two characters have ever had on the show. She is visibly overjoyed to have a father who can be there with her in the way she's always wanted. And then Homer puts the crayon back. He writes Lisa a note first. The note is careful and honest and slightly heartbreaking. "I'm taking the coward's way out," it says. "But before I do, I just want you to know. Being smart made me appreciate how amazing you really are." Then he goes to the back alley surgeon again. The procedure is reversed, and the next scene he is eating a sandwich with glazed eyes and a very large, easy grin. The show doesn't comment on this. The family goes on as before. And that choice, to introduce the crayon, give it a full episode, and then return Homer to exactly as he was, is one of the most interesting decisions in the show's history, because it doesn't reset the theory, it confirms it. Homer knows what he is. On some level, somewhere underneath the crayon, he has always known. He chose the version of himself his family was used to. The familiar presence, the man they could predict, over the version that would have served himself better and hurt them differently. The most articulate thing Homer Simpson has ever said is a note he left for his daughter before deliberately making himself unable to articulate things. The intelligence was always there. He just decided it wasn't worth the cost of having it. The theory also casts an interesting light on Homer's relationship with Bart. Bart is, in many respects, the child Homer was before the crayon. Impulsive, clever in lateral ways, resistant to the systems that don't work for him. Homer's perpetual frustration with Bart, the strangling, the shouting, the bewilderment, reads differently if Homer's looking at a version of himself that still has the full capacity he no longer has. Bart is, at 10, what Homer would have been at 10 if his trajectory hadn't been altered. Homer can see this clearly and doesn't know what to do with it. Bart gets an F. Season 2, Episode 1 is an early and excellent study of this. Homer wants Bart to succeed academically. He tutors him badly. The episode ends with Bart crying genuine tears of frustration over failing the test and then passing it by the skin of his teeth. Homer's pride is enormous and specifically tender. He sees his son do the thing he couldn't do. The emotion in that scene is out of proportion to a simple test result. It's the emotion of a man watching something he lost be preserved in someone he loves. The crayon was lodged in Homer's brain. Homer's not stupid. Those are two facts that coexist, and the show has carried both of them simultaneously since January 2001. There's a specific moment in Homer that I keep coming back to, which is the scene where Homer, with the crayon removed, goes to see a film by himself, just Homer at a movie, without Bart or Marge or anyone else. He cries at the ending, not because it's sad in a simple way, but because he's able to process what he's watching in a way he normally couldn't. The emotional capacity that the crayon had been dulling was always there. It just needed access. And then there's his relationship with Lenny and Carl after the procedure, which is handled with real delicacy. Homer's friends are not going to suddenly become interesting to a man with an IQ of 105. The gap between them, which Homer had never been able to see before, is now visible. He still loves them. He still wants to be with them. But the bar feels different. The conversations feel different. He can hear the limitations in a way he couldn't before. This is what the show is getting at with the crayon theory, I think. Intelligence isn't just a gift. It changes what you can see, which includes things you might have been happier not seeing. The Homer of the early seasons, competent enough, present enough, managing, was living at a level of awareness that cost him less than the Homer without the crayon. Not because the early Homer was incapable of more, but because more came with more pain. The injury protected him from the full weight of his own situation. There's a parallel here with Homer's father Abe, who is depicted across the show's run as a man who has had experiences and capabilities that his dementia and age and the basic indignity of being old in America have obscured. Homer is doing voluntarily what time did to Abe involuntarily. He is choosing the version of himself that can survive his circumstances at the cost of the version that could have understood them. The show never presses too hard on this. It makes the argument, lands it in that final note, and moves on, which is the right call. Some things are more powerful for not being underlined. There's a production level reading of all this too, and I think both readings can be true. The Homer of seasons 1 through 4 was the character as originally conceived. Competent enough, emotionally real, a recognizable human being. The drift toward broader stupidity was real tonal pressure from a writer's room that needed bigger gags and was writing episodically without much reference to what had come before. HOMR was, at least partly, the show's way of acknowledging that drift honestly, turning what could have been dismissed as character inconsistency into a coherent explanation that makes Homer's whole trajectory meaningful rather than accidental. Which is exactly the kind of move The Simpsons makes when it's working at its best. It finds the meaning inside the accident. It frames the coincidence as intention. Whether or not it was always planned, whether the crayon was always going to be there, the show committed to the answer so fully that the question stops mattering. The crayon is in there. The real Homer is in there too. He made his choice. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The Simpsons is set in a permanent present. Bart is 10 years old. He was 10 years old in 1989, and he is 10 years old now, and he will be 10 years old in whatever future the show continues into. Homer was born in 1952, or 1955, or 1956, depending on which episode you consult. Marge has been in her mid-30s since the first season. The town exists in a kind of sustained now, unmoored from the calendar, drifting across historical eras without appearing to move. This is called the floating timeline. The phrase makes it sound like a technical production convention, a practical decision made early in the show's run, and maintained out of inertia. But I don't think that's what it is, or at least not primarily what it is. The longer it's been maintained, and the more deliberately it has been maintained, the more it looks like a considered position about the nature of the show. Let me explain why I think the floating timeline is a philosophical choice rather than a shortcut. Most long-running shows with characters who don't age simply ignore the mathematics. Nobody does the arithmetic on the characters' birth dates. The show continues and the audience accepts the convention without examining it. That is one approach to an obvious problem, and it works fine. The Simpsons took a different approach. It acknowledged the paradox explicitly, drew attention to it, made jokes about it, and kept going anyway. Behind the Laughter, Season 11, Episode 22, which we'll return to in more detail later, is structured as a mockumentary about the show, and one of its running jokes is that the family's ages and history don't quite add up when you look too closely. The characters notice the inconsistency. It's played for a specific kind of comedy. The comedy of something that everyone agrees not to examine being examined. The flashback episodes are more illuminating. The Way We Was, Season 2, Episode 12, aired February 10th, 1991, shows Homer and Marge meeting in 1974. This episode establishes a chronological framework that places Homer at roughly 36 in 1991. Coherent, sensible. But the show has never updated that date to stay consistent with broadcast years. By 2005, that arithmetic makes Homer over 50, which nobody in the show mentions. By 2025, he'd be approaching his mid-70s, and Homer Simpson is most emphatically not approaching his mid-70s. And here's what the writers did when the math became inconvenient. They didn't quietly fix it, they reset it conspicuously. That 90s show, Season 19, Episode 11, aired January 27, 2008. Retconned Homer and Marge's courtship into the 1990s, not the 1970s. Decades shifted. The show essentially said the past adjusts to keep pace with the present. History here is not a fixed track, but a sliding one. This generated significant fan frustration. The continuity break was real, and the episode was fairly criticized. But the writers did it anyway, and that decision says something. They believed the floating timeline was worth protecting at the cost of continuity consistency. The premise that the show exists in a permanent present was more important to them than fidelity to any particular set of dates. The practical argument is straightforward enough, and the showrunner Al Jean has made it clearly. If the characters aged, the show would eventually be about elderly people. The premise depends on children being children, on parents being parents, on the nuclear family existing in the form that makes the show work. Aging would destroy the premise faster than any network cancellation. So the timeline floats out of practical necessity. But Al Jean has also said something more interesting than that, which is that the show is less interested in when things happen than in what things mean. The Simpsons has always been willing to sacrifice chronological accuracy for emotional truth. And Maggie Makes 3, Kathy Ewert, Season 6, Episode 13, tells the story of Maggie's birth as Homer's retrospective oral history to his children. The facts of the story are refracted through who's telling it and what they need it to mean. The year doesn't matter. What matters is the image of the photographs over the letters. Now, here's the part of this theory that I find most genuinely compelling, which is less about production decisions and more about what the floating timeline does for the audience. The Simpsons has been broadcast across decades of real time. During those years, the world has changed substantially. There have been multiple recessions, multiple political upheavals, a global pandemic, a near complete transformation of how people access and consume media, and approximately every kind of cultural change you could catalog. The family at 742 Evergreen Terrace has experienced none of this except in occasional satire. This means that viewers who first watched the show in 1989 bring completely different historical context to it than viewers who first watched it in 2015. And yet both groups are watching the same thing. Bart is 10, Homer is trying, Marge is patient, Springfield is somewhere in America. The floating timeline is a form of hospitality. It ensures that the show's emotional landscape is always roughly contemporaneous with whoever is watching it. The family doesn't age so that the family is always your family's age. Holidays of Future Past, Season 23, Episode 9, aired December 11th, 2011, is perhaps the most beautiful demonstration of what the floating timeline makes possible. The episode imagines a future 30 years on. Bart and Lisa are adults, complicated and interesting and shaped by their childhoods in specific ways. Maggie is a musician. Homer and Marge are grandparents navigating the particular combination of pride and redundancy that comes with that territory. The episode is warm and specific and melancholy in exactly the right measure. It's generally considered one of the best episodes of the modern era. It works, I think, specifically because the show had never committed to a fixed timeline. The floating present means that a future 30 years hence can be anything, can be shaped by character rather than calendar, can reflect who these people would plausibly become rather than what the mathematics demand. If the show had been tracking calendar years, that future would have been pinned to specific dates, and the dates would have dated it. The freedom to float gave the show the freedom to imagine. One more thing. The floating timeline means that every person who has watched The Simpsons across its full run has, in some sense, been watching the same moment. The same family, the same age, the same house. Every generation of viewers comes to the same place and finds the same people there. That's not a coincidence. That's a design. The Japanese concept of ema, the meaningful pause, the interval that is itself a form of communication, gets used a lot in discussions of art and music. There's something similar happening with the floating timeline, which is a kind of temporal ma. The interval between episodes doesn't represent past time in Springfield. It represents nothing. A gap that is somehow both empty and full. a space where the characters exist in some form between visits. You come back and they're where you left them, and that continuity feels like a kind of friendship. Bart Gets Famous, Season 5, Episode 12, has Bart briefly becoming a celebrity based on a single accidental catchphrase, "I didn't do it," and then the fame fading when he can't produce a follow-up. The episode is partly about the nature of cultural celebrity, but it's also, in the context of the floating timeline, about what it means that Bart will be 10 forever. The fame comes and goes. The person underneath it stays. The timeline floating means Bart is always the person underneath the catchphrase, regardless of which episode you're watching. This is the show's quiet guarantee. Whoever these people are, they'll be that when you come back. One more angle on the floating timeline that I find genuinely interesting is how it relates to the show's relationship with cultural references. The Simpsons has always been dense with cultural references into films, television, music, public figures, historical events. In a show with a fixed timeline, those references would date the episodes in a specific way. The Michael Jackson appearance in Season 3 would belong to 1991 and 1991 only. Under the floating timeline, it belongs to a Springfield that exists in a permanent mid-range American now, and the reference reads as the show engaging with popular culture rather than as a document from a specific year. This is why Simpsons episodes from the 1990s remain more accessible than most early 1990s television. The jokes are specific enough to be funny, but not so temporally fixed that they require historical context to land. The timeline floats, and the cultural references float with it, and the episodes stay alive in a way that fixed timeline shows don't quite manage. Homer Badman, Season 6, Episode 9, is explicitly about media satire and the news cycle, and it's remarkable how accurately it describes dynamics that didn't fully manifest until social media. The speed of accusation, the impossibility of correction, the way a narrative takes hold before evidence has been considered. The episode aired in 1994. It's more legible now than it was then. The floating timeline means it doesn't belong to 1994 specifically. It belongs to whenever you watch it. Since we're talking about the floating timeline and what it means for memory, there's an episode that addresses this almost directly, though it doesn't frame itself in those terms. Eternal Moonshine of the Simpson Mind, Season 19, Episode 9, has Homer trying to recover a lost day's worth of memories. He moves through fragments and partial recollections, assembling a picture of what happened from incomplete evidence. The episode treats memory as reconstruction rather than recording. You don't play back what happened, you assemble a version of it from the pieces you still have. This is how the floating timeline works too. The Simpsons past is assembled from fragments, specific episodes, recurring details, acknowledged backstory, rather than from a continuous record. The timeline doesn't play back, it reconstructs. Different episodes reconstruct it differently, because different writers are working from different pieces of the record. What this creates over time is a past that feels real without being fixed. The emotional truth of the show's history, Homer's love for Marge, Bart's complicated relationship with his own potential, Lisa's sense of being slightly out of place in her own family, those things are stable across every version of the reconstructed past. The calendar dates aren't, the feelings are. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Ned Flanders has lost more than anyone else in Springfield. More than Homer, who has had his share of setbacks, but whose basic domestic architecture, the house, the family, the couch, has remained intact across the show's entire run. More than any other character in the show's history, Ned has had everything he tried to build taken from him twice, and has responded each time not with bitterness or collapse, but by rebuilding from wherever he was standing. The show is named after The Simpsons. The tragedy, the accumulated human weight, the fully earned character arc, all of that belongs to the man next door. Ned is introduced in Season 1 as Homer's foil. He has everything Homer visibly lacks: a tidy house, a disciplined life, a thriving small business, obedient, well-adjusted children, a loving marriage, and an apparently effortless good humor. Homer resents him immediately and has continued resenting him across the show's full history, and the show plays this resentment as one of its most reliable sources of comedy. It works beautifully. Ned's relentless positivity is funny in exact proportion to Homer's inability to match it. And then came Hurricane Neddy, Season 8, Episode 8, aired December 29, 1996. Written by Steve Young, a hurricane destroys Ned's house. The town rallies to rebuild it, enthusiastically, incompetently, and with complete disregard for structural standards or load-bearing requirements. Homer organizes the effort, and the result is a disaster. The house falls apart the moment Ned first touches it. The door handle comes off, the walls wobble, the roof is wrong. And Ned, who has maintained his cheerfulness through every prior indignity the show has subjected him to, goes off. He walks down Evergreen Terrace shouting at everyone. Marge is a big hair phony. Homer is called several very specific things. He tells Barney his breath smells. He tells Reverend Lovejoy his sermons are boring. He tells Apu he's been overcharging people for years and everyone knows it. He says everything you'd say to your absolute worst enemy to people who just spent their weekend trying to help him. And then the episode reveals why. Ned's parents were freewheeling types. The word they use is beatniks. They believed in zero discipline, in the idea that any correction was harmful to a child's development. When young Ned acted out, as children do, they did nothing. He spent years expressing completely normal childhood anger and frustration with no guidance whatsoever while it accumulated. They brought him to a child psychiatrist named Dr. Foster at the age of 8. The therapy was intensive and Dr. Foster believed successful. Ned's aggression was eliminated. His behavior became, by external standards, exemplary. The problem is that the anger didn't go anywhere. It was suppressed, thoroughly and permanently, behind a wall of goodwill and positive language and the particular relentlessness of a man who has been managing himself every single day since he was 8 years old. He hasn't been cheerful. He has been controlled. That single revelation reframes every Ned scene that preceded it. Every okilly-dokilly, every patient smile while Homer borrows the lawnmower and never returns it. Every morning wave across the hedge, all of it is the surface of something that was managed into near invisibility 50 years ago and has been maintained at considerable personal cost ever since. The goodwill isn't natural. It is the result of sustained, daily effort. Ned Flanders is possibly the hardest working character in the show now. Maud Flanders dies in Season 11, Episode 14, Alone Again, Natura Diddly, aired February 13th, 2000. She is killed by a t-shirt cannon at a NASCAR race. A vendor launches promotional t-shirts into the crowd. Homer ducks. The shirts hit Maud instead. She goes off the back of the bleachers. The circumstances are grotesque in their absurdity. The death itself is not played absurdly at all. Maud's death was contractual. Voice actress Maggie Roswell had a dispute with Fox over travel expenses and left the show. The writers chose to kill the character rather than recast, and the decision of how to handle Ned's widowhood was entirely theirs. What they chose to do with it was, I think, one of the most responsible and serious decisions the show has made. Ned doesn't recover quickly, he doesn't crack a joke, he tries to set up a telephone prayer line, and the number is accidentally printed as an adults-only line. He goes on a series of disastrous dates that the show plays with genuine awkwardness rather than easy comedy. He is seen more than once simply not being all right in ways that the show doesn't excuse or resolve by episode's end. This treatment of grief, sustained across multiple episodes over multiple seasons, was unusual for the show and unusual for primetime animation generally. The Simpsons let Ned grieve. It didn't fix him. And then eventually Edna Krabappel, Bart's third grade teacher, deeply cynical, frequently bored, openly sarcastic about children, about men, about most things. Divorced, prone to smoking. A woman who has spent years in a dead-end job at an underfunded school dealing with a rotating cast of children she only occasionally finds interesting. She is, in almost every respect, the opposite of Maud Flanders. The relationship was confirmed through a viewer vote in 2011. The writers showed Ned and Edna in a relationship without explanation, asked the audience whether it should continue, and honored the result. By season 23, they were in a committed partnership. Ned in Edna's blend presents them as, essentially, married in all but the formal paperwork. The relationship works, and the reason it works is interesting. Ned's patience and Edna's sharpness turn out to be complementary rather than incompatible. His sustained effort to be good meets her sustained refusal to pretend, and something functional and even tender comes out of it. Marcia Wallace, who had voiced Edna since the first season, died on October 25, 2013. She had been battling breast cancer. The episode that followed, Season 25, Episode 4, Four Regrettings and a Funeral, contained a tribute card at its conclusion, a single sentence. In loving memory of Edna Krabappel, she made us better people. Ned was widowed twice, by two characters who couldn't have been more different. Twice he stood at the place where something he'd built was gone, and twice he kept standing. The show has never made a huge production of this arc. It hasn't paused to acknowledge the accumulated weight of what Ned has carried. It's continued, as it always does, with Homer's latest adventure and the next crisis and the next installment of whatever the current season is built around. Ned is next door, the hedge is tidy, the window light is on. But here's what I keep thinking about. Every character in The Simpsons has adventures. Homer has adventures. Bart has adventures. Even minor characters get their showcase episodes and their moments of crisis and resolution. What Ned has across the show's full run is a life. A continuous, accumulating, earned, occasionally devastating human life. The kind you don't get to skip past, and the kind that doesn't resolve into a lesson at the end of 22 minutes. The show is named after The Simpsons. I wouldn't change that. But the thing that the show has actually been building, with the most patience and the most consistency, is the man at 744 Evergreen Terrace, doing what he was taught to do at age 8, which is to keep going without letting the box drop. Rod and Todd Flanders are worth a paragraph because they're often treated as accessories to Ned's story rather than as characters in their own right. The boys are, on the surface, a gentle parody of extremely sheltered religious upbringing. They're naive about popular culture, intensely well-behaved, occasionally disturbing in their piety. The show plays this for comedy, but in the post-Maud episodes, Rod and Todd take on a different quality. They're children who lost their mother. The show doesn't focus on this at length, but it doesn't ignore it either. There are episodes where the boy's particular innocence is framed less as sheltering gone too far, and more as the natural result of two children being carefully protected by a father who knows what loss is, and is trying to ensure they feel as little of it as possible for as long as possible. Ned's parenting of Rod and Todd in this reading is not repression, it's protection. It's a man who has had his share of devastation making a specific choice to keep his children from it for as long as he can. Whether that's the right choice is a separate question. That it comes from love is not in doubt. This is the kind of thing the show does quietly and consistently. The character detail that accumulates across episodes and takes on weight you didn't realize it had until you look back from some distance. Ned's relationship with his boys is part of his arc. It's just never announced as such, and the boys' religiosity is handled with more honesty than you might expect. Rod in particular has moments of what reads as genuine spiritual experience that the show neither mocks nor validates. They're just there, presented without the easy comedic puncture the show usually applies to religious sentiment. The satire in The Simpsons is of hypocrisy and institutional complacency, not of belief itself. Ned's faith is presented as real. The show never undercuts it, which makes his losses more resonant. A man with deep faith losing things is something else entirely. I want to spend a moment on Ned's relationship with Homer because it's one of the show's sustained achievements and I don't think it gets enough credit. Homer resents Ned. This is one of the show's oldest and most reliable dynamics, and the comedy depends on the resentment being somewhat irrational. Homer doesn't have a specific grievance, he just cannot stand being next to someone who so visibly has what Homer doesn't. But the resentment is also, in its way, a form of recognition. Homer doesn't resent the people he has no opinion of. He resents Ned because Ned represents a version of life that Homer can see but can't reach. But the show occasionally allows the relationship to go somewhere else. Homer Loves Flanders, Season 5, Episode 16, is an episode about Homer genuinely enjoying Ned's company for a sustained period, and Ned being made profoundly uncomfortable by it. The joke is that Ned doesn't know how to handle Homer's affection. But the emotional truth underneath is that these two men, for all their differences, are not actually incompatible. They just got assigned to the wrong version of each other. Hurricane Neddy is also, in its way, a story about Homer. He organizes the house rebuilding effort. He is enthusiastic and incompetent and ultimately responsible for the structure that destroys Ned's composure when it falls apart. And his response, when Ned is taken to a psychiatric institution, is not defensive or dismissive. He drives there and he sits with him. He doesn't know what to say, he almost never does, but he shows up. That's the thing about Homer and Ned across every season of the show. Homer always shows up. Badly, with poor timing, and usually making things somewhat worse. But present, Ned's arc, from the managed cheerfulness of Season 1 through the revealed rage of Season 8, through the losses and the rebuilding, is the show's most complete portrait of what it costs to be good. Not accidentally good, not effortlessly good, but deliberately good every day as a sustained act of will. The show built this portrait slowly across decades in the margins of Homer's larger story. That's exactly the right place for it. Goodness doesn't need the spotlight to be real. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The Simpsons predicts things. Everyone knows this. It has become its own category of internet content. The tweet, the screenshot, the breathless video, the "they did it again" caption with 12 million reposts. And the predictions are real. They happened. A Trump presidency referenced 16 years before the event. Fox as a division of Disney 2 decades before the merger. Tablet computers, smartwatches, video calling, 3-camera home surveillance, the Greek financial crisis, a specific Swedish Nobel laureate. These are facts, not fan theories. The show made jokes about things that later became real. The question is what those facts mean. And the dominant popular interpretation that the show has uncanny prescience, that the writers are oracles, that something supernatural is happening, is wrong. And the reason it's wrong is, I think, genuinely more interesting than the supernatural reading. The show is not prescient, it is observant, there is a meaningful difference, and it rewards unpacking. Let's start with the Trump prediction because it's the most famous and the most instructive. Bart to the Future, Season 11, Episode 17, aired March 19, 2000. Imagines a future where Lisa Simpson is President of the United States. She has taken over from a predecessor who left the country broke. The predecessor is identified as President Trump. Writer Dan Graney spoke to The Hollywood Reporter in March 2016 after the real Trump's campaign became unmistakable. He said the episode was conceived as a warning to America. Not a prediction, a warning. They were writing about the logical conclusion of celebrity culture. The idea that fame and wealth had become not just possible, but sufficient qualifications for political office. Trump had been a prominent public figure since the 1980s. He had been making noises about running for president as a kind of brand exercise since 1988. He had appeared on television constantly for 2 decades. He was the walking embodiment of a specific kind of American celebrity power. The joke wasn't, what if Trump becomes president someday? It was, here is what happens when a country has decided that being famous is the same as being qualified. That's not a prediction. That's a satirical extrapolation of an observable existing tendency. The show was describing a direction of travel, not seeing the future. The Disney-Fox merger is even cleaner as an example. When You Dish Upon a Star aired in 1998. By 1998, Disney had already acquired ABC, had established Miramax, was in the middle of the period of entertainment consolidation that had been building since the late 1980s. The Simpsons, as a Fox property, was unusually positioned to notice and satirize the entertainment industry's structural tendency toward consolidation. The joke, Fox, a division of Disney, was the logical endpoint of a pattern that was already visible and already being discussed, not prophecy, observation. The technology predictions are perhaps the most interesting because they reflect something specific about who was in the room. The early writers' rooms were populated with well-educated people who were paying close attention to emerging technology. This was the early 1990s, when the personal computer revolution was well underway, when mobile communication was expanding rapidly, when the internet was beginning to become a consumer phenomenon. The smartwatch in Lisa's wedding, Season 6, Episode 19, March 19th, 1995, is a wrist communicator used for video calls. Wearable technology and portable video communication were both active areas of research in 1994 and 1995. The joke was that this technology was clearly coming, and it was funny to imagine it in 2010. The joke wasn't random, it was derived from knowing what was being developed. Now here's the volume argument, which is real and matters. The show produces around 22 episodes a year, has done so for decades, and covers every facet of American life. Politics, healthcare, entertainment, technology, food culture, religion, international relations, sports, celebrity, science, finance. At that scale, the show has satirized several thousand distinct social and cultural phenomena. Some fraction of satire, by definition, describes real tendencies that eventually manifest. The base rate of The Simpsons made a joke about something that later happened is automatically high before any special prescience enters the picture. But here's where the theory becomes genuinely compelling, and this is the part I actually find interesting beyond the volume argument. Map the correct predictions. Not the near misses or the vague resemblances, but the ones that clearly landed. The Trump presidency, the Disney merger, the surveillance technology, the wearable devices, the commodification of public attention, the collapse of labor protections, the consolidation of media. These predictions don't distribute randomly across topics. They cluster specifically around a set of related themes. How corporate power concentrates, how celebrity displaces qualification, how technology both enables and monitors, how the small things that make daily life meaningful get absorbed into larger commercial systems. That is not a random assortment of guesses. That is a coherent worldview, consistently expressed across the show's full run. The writers were paying attention to power. Week after week, season after season, they were asking, how does money move? How does fame operate? Who benefits? Who doesn't? And where is this all going? And they kept writing about it in animated form for 30 million viewers, framed as light entertainment. Graney said the Trump episode was a warning. I believe him. And I think if you look at the broader pattern of the show's most accurate predictions, they all have that quality. They were attempts to say, look at the direction this is traveling, look at where this leads, delivered in the form that reaches the most people and generates the least resistance. A cartoon, a yellow family, a gentle half-hour comedy. The predictions came true. The warnings mostly didn't take. That isn't the show's fault. That's what warnings are like. There's a lovely irony in the fact that the show's most celebrated predictions tend to be the ones about technology. The smartwatches, the tablets, the video calls, because these are, in some ways, the predictions that required the least insight. Technology predictions are relatively easy when you have access to current research and development reporting. The predictions about human nature, about how celebrity and power interact, about how institutions behave when nobody is watching, about what people will do when given the option to opt out of civic responsibility. Those are harder, and the show has been right about them far more consistently. Homer the Great, Season 6, Episode 12, is about the human need to belong to exclusive groups, the way exclusivity creates value independent of the actual content of what the group offers, and how quickly institutional corruption follows from concentrated social power. The episode aired in 1995. None of those observations have aged at all. One specific prediction worth dwelling on is the financial crisis one. The PTA disbands. Season 6, Episode 21, has a teacher strike and the school replacing teachers with various improvised alternatives, including automated learning systems. The episode aired in 1995. The specific anxiety it was satirizing, the substitution of technology for human educational relationships in the name of cost-cutting, has been a real and ongoing debate in education for 30 years since. The show wasn't predicting a specific event. It was identifying a structural tendency and putting it in a form that was funny, but also, if you were paying attention, a bit uncomfortable. The Last Temptation of Homer, Season 5, Episode 9, has Homer navigating workplace attraction while committed to his marriage, in a workplace that has no functioning HR infrastructure. The comedy depends on the total inadequacy of the systems meant to manage these situations. 15 years later, Me Too, as a cultural moment, revealed that this inadequacy was not a Springfield-specific problem. The show keeps being right about structural things not because it sees the future, but because structural problems don't resolve on their own. The Simpsons identified a problem, made it funny, and the problem continued existing until it became impossible to continue ignoring. That's the prediction. Not, this specific thing will happen on this date. More like, this tendency exists and it will eventually become undeniable. Something that doesn't get mentioned in most Simpsons predictions discussions is the technology the show has depicted that didn't come true. The flying cars that didn't materialize, the specific social arrangements of its imagined futures that haven't played out, the technologies that were predicted and didn't land. The prediction narrative selectively remembers the hits and forgets the misses, which is how prediction narratives generally work. The show's batting average on specific technological and political predictions is, if you count the misses honestly, not supernatural. It's the batting average of a very smart, very well-informed writer's room that thought seriously about trends for many years. But the thematic predictions, the ones about the direction of power and culture rather than specific events, are different. Those have a remarkably high hit rate. The consolidation of entertainment into a handful of corporations, yes. The conversion of political process into entertainment format, yes. The normalization of surveillance as a consumer product, yes. The erosion of local community infrastructure in favor of large commercial chains, yes. These themes run through the show continuously from its earliest seasons. Homer the Smithers, Season 7, Episode 17, is about Smithers being temporarily replaced by Homer as Burns' assistant, and what happens when you substitute loyalty with mere compliance. Burns' Heir, Season 5, Episode 18, is about how wealth shapes the capacity to acquire affection. You Only Move Twice, Season 8, Episode 2, is about how corporate benevolence is structurally inseparable from corporate control. These are not just jokes, they're accurate descriptions of how power works, delivered in animated form. The writers were paying attention, that's the prediction. Decades of paying very close attention. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Maggie Simpson has never said a complete sentence in the entire run of the show. There was one moment, a single episode, Some Enchanted Evening, the season 1 finale, broadcast May 13th, 1990. Has a brief scene at the very end where Maggie says her first word. The word is daddy. It is voiced by Elizabeth Taylor, who was recruited for the role with considerable difficulty. Elizabeth Taylor, one of the most celebrated screen actresses of the 20th century, contributed one word to The Simpsons. That is how much Maggie's first word mattered to the production. Then the show reset. Maggie went back to the pacifier. She has not spoken since, and the non-speaking has now been running for over 3 decades. What I want to argue here is that the silence is not a limitation of Maggie as a character. It is the characterization. And once you read the show through Maggie, once you track what she does, what she causes, what she represents, you realize she has been doing more structural and emotional heavy lifting than any other character for the entire run of the show. The most important single piece of evidence is, and Maggie makes 3, Season 6, Episode 13, aired January 22nd, 1995. The episode is structured as Homer's oral history to his children. How did Maggie come to exist? Homer had quit the nuclear plant. He'd achieved his dream, the one he'd written on his wall as a young man, of working at a bowling alley. He was genuinely and specifically happy, content in a way the show rarely allows him to be. Then Marge became pregnant with a 3rd child. The bowling alley couldn't pay enough to support the family, and Homer had to go back to Mr. Burns and ask for his old job back. Burns was, of course, cruel about it. The job was given back with humiliation attached, a motivational plaque placed at Homer's workstation, reading, "Don't forget, you're here forever." The joke at Homer's expense. The reminder that he came back, that he had to. The episode ends with the reveal that the show delivers without announcing, without musical swell, without any particular preparation. The camera moves through the power plant to Homer's station. There, beneath the plaque, Homer has placed photographs of Maggie. Specific photographs arranged precisely, so that the plaque now reads something different. The letters not covered by photographs spell out, "Do it for her." Homer arranged this himself. He told nobody. He didn't mention it to Marge or to Bart and Lisa until the evening he told them the story years later. It wasn't performed for anyone's approval. It wasn't a statement. It was just what he did. I've watched The Simpsons more times than I can count, and that image, the photographs arranged over the humiliation, Homer's private rearrangement of the thing meant to diminish him into something that sustains him, is still the emotional center of the entire show for me. Not a theory, not an interpretation, just the truest thing the show has ever done. Now, the other thing Maggie did. Season 6, Episode 1. Who Shot Mr. Burns? Part 2, aired September 10th, 1995. The previous season's cliffhanger had been Who Shot Mr. Burns, Springfield's most powerful man. The writers had constructed an elaborate mystery with multiple suspects, planted clues, and launched an actual viewer contest. The answer was Maggie. She didn't plan it. Burns reached into her stroller to steal her lollipop. She had his own gun in her hand. She'd picked it up at some point during the confusion, which is a detail that becomes funnier the more you think about what it says about the Simpson household. She reacted to someone taking something from her. Pure reflex, no motive in any adult sense. She was an infant doing what infants do. The viewer contest produced not a single correct guess. Not one person among the thousands who entered submitted Maggie Simpson as the shooter. The commentary track on the DVD confirms this with some evident satisfaction. The answer was genuinely surprising, but it's also thematically exact, in a way that doesn't feel like an accident. The character who couldn't explain herself, couldn't be interrogated, couldn't form a motive in any legally actionable sense, the character with no voice, was the one who acted. Every adult in Springfield was a suspect with a motive. The infant with the pacifier was the perpetrator. The most powerful man in town was brought down by the character the show treats as its most peripheral. There's a whole constellation of Maggie moments that extend this pattern, and once you start tracking them, they become quite striking. She routinely solves problems that the adult characters cannot. She wins a staring contest with a cat that runs for several hours in Homer Loves Flanders. She escapes from various impossible situations with a calm that eludes every competent adult around her. In multiple episodes, she is shown picking up books or objects and interacting with them with a degree of engagement that the adults in the room consistently fail to notice. The Treehouse of Horror segments have allowed the writers to be more explicit about Maggie's capabilities than the regular show can. In horror segments, she's been shown as capable of violence, of strategy, of emotional depth. All things the regular show can't fully express because she's a non-speaking infant, and expressing them fully would break the premise. The show imagined an adult Maggie in a season 34 episode, and the choice of what adult Maggie became is interesting. A labor activist and union organizer, not a scientist or politician or an artist. A person who organizes working people. This is politically the most radical trajectory imagined for any Simpson child, including Lisa, who typically gets the future leader roles. Maggie, it turns out, becomes the person who tries to change the actual conditions of work. And then there is her music. Alf Clausen, the show's primary composer for most of its run, wrote character themes for each member of the family. They're subtle, embedded in the underscore, heard in particular emotional moments rather than announced. Maggie's theme is the only one that resolves on a major chord. Every other family member gets something harmonically more complex, more ambivalent, more unresolved. Maggie's music ends somewhere purely, settledly warm. That seems right. She's the character who has never been able to say, "I love you." She's also the character who has demonstrated it through action continuously across over 30 years of television. The show knows this. The music knows this. The silence is not an absence. It is the shape of something that doesn't need words. The Maggie merchandise phenomenon is its own small study in how a silent character communicates. Of the 5 Simpson family members, Maggie is the one whose image has most consistently appeared on items associated with care. Baby goods, nursery items, things marketed toward parents of young children. The show's production has understood at some level that Maggie represents something specific about early childhood. The period before language, before the fully socialized self, when you are entirely yourself because you haven't learned to be anything else. There's a philosopher's argument in here about what language does to experience, whether having words for things changes the things themselves. Maggie's pre-linguistic state keeps her outside that question. She experiences Springfield without narrating it. She responds without explaining. This makes her, counterintuitively, the most authentic character in the show. Homer explains himself constantly, and the explanations are usually wrong. Liza articulates her feelings precisely and is often lonelier for it. Maggie just is what she is, without commentary, in every episode she's ever appeared in. The pacifier isn't passivity, it's just not yet. Watching, present, sufficient. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Every October, The Simpsons sets the rules aside. Characters can die, the family can be destroyed, the town can end, the planet can end. None of it will carry over. Come November, the show returns to exactly the shape it was before, as if nothing happened. The Treehouse of Horror episodes are explicitly non-canonical. 3 horror shorts per year, broadly themed around Halloween, permitted to break the show's continuity because they're framed as stories rather than events. This is described as a production format. Simple enough. Except the things that get said in those shorts are almost never simple. And the darker you go with them, the more they look less like holiday entertainment and more like the place where the show says what it actually thinks. Things it can't say in the regular episodes because the regular episodes have to reset. I've been thinking about this framing for a while. The treehouse of horror episodes as the show's unconscious, the place where the anxieties and truths that the regular show manages, contains, and neutralizes through comedy and reset get to come out, safely wrapped in the non-canon packaging. The Shining Treehouse of Horror. 5, Season 6, Episode 6, October 30th, 1994, is a parody of The Shining. Homer, as Jack Torrance, is placed in an isolated resort, cut off from beer and television. He goes mad. He chases his family through the corridors with an axe. He is eventually frozen in the snow. It is very funny. The gags are well executed. The parody is affectionate. But watch it straight, without the comedy framing. And what you're watching is a portrait of Homer as genuinely dangerous. A man whose capacity for violence and frustration is only ever kept manageable by the domestic sedatives of his ordinary life. The beer keeps the frustration at a sustainable level. The television provides the passive absorption that the frustration needs, the couch, the routine, the pattern of the day. Without any of that, what remains is a man with an axe chasing his wife through a hedge maze. The regular show can't say that directly. Saying it directly would destroy the comedy of every ordinary Homer scene, would make every beer too loaded, every couch too significant. The treehouse can say it because it's not canonical. It goes in October. Nobody has to live with it. Time and Punishment, in the same episode, has Homer trapped in a time machine, his broken toaster, which is very Simpsons. Repeatedly traveling to the past and returning to a present that has been altered by his small accidents. He kills a mosquito and comes home to a version of Springfield where everyone is enormous. He sneezes on a dinosaur and comes home to a world run by Flanders. Each attempt to fix the problems creates new ones. He eventually arrives in a version of the present where everything looks right. The house, the family, dinner on the table, the smell of food, the warmth of the kitchen, except that everyone has lizard tongues. Homer considers going back. He could try again. The mechanism is right there. He looks at the lizard tongues, he shrugs. Close enough, he says. The credits roll on that. I think that is the most honest ending in the show's history in any format. The idea that you iterate towards something acceptable and then you stop because the alternative is going back indefinitely with no guarantee of improvement. That's not a cartoon joke. That's what it actually feels like to be in a relationship or a family or a life. You get to close enough, you stay. The lizard tongues are whatever the lizard tongues are in your particular version of the kitchen. Homer 3, Treehouse of Horror 6, Season 7, Episode 6, October 30th, 1995. Sends Homer into a three-dimensional mathematical space to hide from Marge's sisters. At the episode's end, Homer's dimension collapses entirely, and he is expelled into the real world. The final sequence is live-action footage. Homer walks through what appears to be a real commercial street. He is animated, clearly superimposed on real footage, clearly out of place. He ends up at an erotic bakery and buys something. That's the ending. This is the only time in the show's history that it has acknowledged that its characters are cartoons. The only time the show's unreality has been directly depicted. And it's in a Halloween episode, the non-canonical wrapper, because acknowledging it in a regular episode would be too destabilizing. The characters can't live with knowing their drawings. The treehouse can hold that knowledge for one evening and then put it away. The Devil and Homer Simpson, Treehouse of Horror 4, Season 5, Episode 5, October 30th, 1993, is the most theologically loaded thing the show has ever produced. Homer sells his soul for a donut. He is judged by a jury of the damned. He is saved by Marge presenting their marriage certificate as evidence that Homer already pledged his soul to her. The Devil, voiced and designed along the lines of Mr. Burns, loses the case. The regular show has God in it. God appears as a character, always with 5 fingers while everyone else has 4, always positioned as benevolent but limited. The show has a cosmology it cannot fully press on in its regular episodes without changing the fundamental character of the comedy. In the Halloween segment, it can press on it completely. The soul, the devil, the demonic contract, the question of what Homer's love for Marge actually means in metaphysical terms. All of it gets addressed thoroughly and movingly in an episode that technically didn't happen. There's a broader pattern worth noting. Many of the Treehouse segments that land most powerfully are the ones where the horror is not external, not a monster or a supernatural threat, but internal. The Shinning is about Homer. Time and Punishment is about Homer's relationship with consequence. The Devil and Homer Simpson is about what Homer has underneath everything that matters. The Horror Anthology is the place where the show turns the camera on its own characters without the protection of comedy and status quo restoration. And here's what strikes me about the format over 35 iterations. Every year, the show produces 3 segments that allow it to be honest in ways the regular show can't be. And every year, the next episode, everything is fine. The family is intact. Homer is on the couch. The lizard tongues are gone. There's something generous in that structure, actually. The darkness gets to exist. The uncomfortable truths get to be said. And then they go back in the box and November is ordinary again. The unconscious does its work and goes back to sleep. The recurring use of the same production elements across the Treehouse segments is evidence of something deliberately maintained. The framing device, Bart, Lisa, and Maggie sitting in a tree telling stories, or the family gathered on the couch while a host introduces the segments, has evolved over 35 years but maintained consistent logic. The family is the audience for the horror, which means the horror is always, in some sense, performed for them. They are both inside the stories and outside them. The Treehouse format holds the family in a particular double position. They are narrators and subjects simultaneously. This is most explicit in the segments where Homer is the monster, not a victim of the monster, but the monster himself. Jack Torrance, the devil's emissary in Devil and Homer Simpson. The man eaten by the house in Treehouse of Horrors 6. When Homer is the threat, the family's relationship to the horror changes. They're not being scared by something external. They're being confronted with a version of their own father that normally can't exist in the regular show. The regular show's comedy depends on Homer being fundamentally safe. He causes damage, but he doesn't endanger his family in any serious sense. The Treehouse segments can take that safety away and explore what's underneath it, because none of it will count. The reset button allows the exploration to happen without cost. There's also something interesting about the Treehouse's relationship to time. The Halloween segments are the one annual moment when the show acknowledges that a year has passed, that it's October again, that seasons change, that the world moves. In a show built on the floating timeline, this is notable. The Treehouse of Horror is the show's clock. Not a clock that measures development or change, but one that marks the passage of time itself. October, then November, then eventually October again, 35 times. The horror is what marks the calendar. That's either an accident of scheduling or a very elegant structural decision. I lean toward the latter. The Island of Dr. Hibbert, from Treehouse of Horror. 13, Season 14, Episode 1, aired November 3rd, 2002. Has the family visiting a resort where people have been turned into human-animal hybrids by Dr. Hibbert. The episode is a parody of The Island of Dr. Moreau. What's interesting about it in the context of the Treehouse, as unconscious, is what the after looks like. The family has been transformed, the transformations are comfortable and settled, and the ending has them remaining in their new forms because the new forms turn out to be okay. They've become something else and they're fine with it. This is the Treehouse doing something the regular show genuinely cannot, depicting a permanent change in the family and asking, what if the change is acceptable? What if becoming something different isn't a disaster? The main show's format requires restoration. The treehouse can end without it. Dial Z for Zombie. Treehouse of Horror 3 has Bart raising the dead, who then proceed to eat everyone in Springfield. The living Simpsons fight their way through it. What I always notice in this segment is how practically Homer responds to an emergency. The zombie apocalypse is here. Homer's response is organized and purposeful. He gets a gun, he protects the family, he doesn't panic. This is the version of Homer capable under genuine extreme pressure that the crayon theory talks about. The treehouse shows it because the treehouse doesn't have to then walk it back in the next scene. The horror format gives the show permission to be honest about capability and darkness simultaneously. That permission is the point of having the format at all. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. 742 Evergreen Terrace is where the Simpsons live. It's where the family dinners happen, where the crises unfold, where most of the show's action takes place. Moe's Tavern, 57 Walnut Street, or sometimes just the bar. The address has floated as much as Springfield's location, is where the show tells the truth. I've been turning this over for a while, and the argument I keep arriving at is this. Every major emotional revelation in The Simpsons, every moment when a character says something genuinely honest about their situation, every scene where the social performance falls away happens at the bar or in its immediate proximity. The family home is where things are managed. The tavern is where things are admitted. Let me go through this carefully because I think the pattern is more consistent than it first appears. Duffless, Season 4, Episode 16, February 18th, 1993, is the episode where Homer gives up beer for a month. Marge confiscates his car keys after a DUI incident. He agrees to sobriety. The episode then follows what happens when the bar goes away. What happens is that Homer and Marge have to actually spend time together. They go cycling, they talk. The conversations are slightly awkward, slightly tender, and notably more real than most of what passes between them in a regular episode. The episode makes a specific observation. The nightly beer at Moe's is a pressure valve. It releases the built-up frustration of Homer's day so he can come home at a manageable level. Without the pressure valve, what's underneath goes somewhere else, either into the marriage directly or into a different kind of relationship with Marge. By the end of the month, Homer has been sober, has reconnected with Marge in an unexpected way, and then goes to the bar and orders a beer. The bar was always going to be there. He just needed to know why he went. Flaming Moe's, Season 3, Episode 10, November 21st, 1991, is about Homer's drink recipe being stolen by Moe, who turns it into a successful cocktail called the Flaming Moe and builds a thriving business around it. The episode is structured as a comedy, but what makes it work beyond the comedy is how seriously Homer's grief is played. He doesn't want the credit for its own sake. He needed something at the bar to be specifically his, a thing that belonged to him in the one place where he goes to just be himself. The recipe was that thing. Moe taking it wasn't just theft, it was displacement. The episode ends by giving the drink back to Homer, in a sense. The secret ingredient is revealed, the mystique is destroyed, the cocktail loses its cachet. The bar returns to its ordinary self. Homer gets his ordinary back. It's a small restoration, but it's the right one. The Homer, Lenny, Carl conversations across the show's history are, I think, the show's most sustained portrait of male friendship. These three men have occupied those stools since the first season. They are witnesses to each other's lives in a way that the family, oddly, isn't. Homer can tell Lenny and Carl things that he can't tell Marge. Not because the feelings are different, but because the bar is the one space in Springfield that has no expectations attached to it. You don't have to be a good father at the bar. You don't have to be a reliable provider. You don't have to be anything other than someone who showed up and ordered something. The bar creates a specific kind of permission. Homer's Barbershop Quartet Season 5, Episode 1, September 30th, 1993, begins with Homer revealing to his family that he had an entire career before them that they knew nothing about. A successful barbershop quartet, a Grammy, a session with George Harrison. None of them knew because Homer never mentioned it. The story surfaces at a swap meet, but the emotional context is a conversation at the bar. Homer telling Lenny and Carl something that his family didn't know in the place where that kind of disclosure is possible. Moe himself is worth spending some time on because Moe is one of the show's most complicated characters, and his complications are almost entirely expressed within his own establishment. The surface version of Moe is a long-running joke. He's isolated, romantically unsuccessful, gets prank called by Bart, is violent and emotionally volatile. The show has used Moe's loneliness as comedy across decades. Some of it is unkind, most of it is honest. Mona Lisa, Season 18, Episode 5, does something unusual. It takes Moe seriously as a creative person. The episode reveals that Moe writes poetry in private. Not bad poetry, specific, emotionally honest poetry that he keeps in a notebook and has never shown anyone. Lisa discovers it, arranges its publication, and the literary world notices. Moe is briefly recognized. Then the literary world takes all the credit, as it tends to. And Moe ends up back behind the bar with the notebook where he started. The episode has the same basic structure as Flaming Moe's. Something that belonged to Moe being taken away. But where the original episode restored Homer's ordinary, this one doesn't restore anything. Moe just goes back, and the bar is still there, as it always is. That's the bar's essential quality, I think. It doesn't fix anything, it absorbs everything. Every crisis Homer has, every failure Lenny and Carl witness, every night Barney doesn't quite fall off the stool. The bar is there for all of it without any particular therapeutic intention. Moe isn't a counselor. He's barely a friend, technically. He stays open. He says terrible things and then pours another drink. He doesn't close. There's a long literary tradition of the tavern as the honest space. The place outside the social contract where the real conversations happen, where status doesn't travel through the door, where what you are is more important than what you appear to be. The Simpsons inherited that tradition and built a very good version of it. The family home is performance, of normalcy, of competence, of love, of the family functioning as it should. The bar is where the performance stops and something truer gets said. The address may float. The bar has never been closed. The economic dimension of Moe's is worth one more mention. The bar is canonically not very profitable. Moe survives on a combination of the regulars' modest spend, occasional windfalls, and what appears to be an extremely low overhead. He has no staff. The decorations haven't changed since what appears to be the 1970s. The health code violations are presumably spectacular, and yet it endures. Every other small business in Springfield has a life cycle. Opens, thrives briefly, fails spectacularly. Moe's just continues. This durability is, in the show's mythology, unexplained and possibly inexplicable. It's the one institution in Springfield that isn't subject to the usual rules of commercial viability. It exists because it needs to exist, and the show's world bends around that necessity. Bart sells his soul. Season 7, Episode 4, has a subplot where Moe's attempts to rebrand as a family restaurant called Uncle Moe's Family Feedbag. The experiment is catastrophic in various specific ways and ends with Moe returning to the original format. The episode is partly about what happens when you try to make a thing into what it isn't. Moe's is a bar. It can't be a family restaurant because it is too specifically, essentially itself, to become something else. The bar survives its attempted transformation and returns to what it was. This seems right. Some things survive by being irreducible. The geography of Moe's Tavern within Springfield is also worth a brief thought. In most episodes, Moe's is depicted as a short walk from 742 Evergreen Terrace. Homer goes there frequently enough that walking is clearly viable, but it's also described variously as being on Walnut Street, near the town center, near the nuclear plant, near the elementary school. Like Springfield itself, the bar's location floats to wherever the scene needs it to be. This seems right for what the bar is. It's the place that's always accessible, always near enough to get to when you need it. The geography bends to make that possible. In a show that is, on one level, deeply invested in the texture of domestic American life, having a bar that is always within walking distance of wherever Homer happens to be is not a continuity error. It's an expression of how the bar actually functions as the space that is always available wherever the crisis is. Homer versus Patty and Selma, Season 6, Episode 17, has Homer borrowing money from Marge's sisters and then spending most of the episode finding ways to avoid repaying the debt. The bar features as the place he goes to avoid the problem. This is the bar as avoidance mechanism rather than resolution mechanism, which is honest about what bars are for a lot of the time. Not every visit to Moe's is emotional revelation. Sometimes it's just somewhere to be that isn't home. The show holds both versions of the bar simultaneously. The place of honest disclosure and the place of comfortable avoidance, without resolving them into a single function. Because bars are both of those things. The Simpsons knew that and built accordingly. One of the things I find most interesting about Moe's Tavern as a space is the way it handles class. Springfield is a town with a fairly clear economic hierarchy. Burns at the top, various professional classes in the middle, the nuclear plant workers and service workers toward the bottom. This hierarchy is mostly respected across the show's setting. People live in the houses that correspond to their economic position. They drive the cars that correspond to their income. They have the relationships with institutions that correspond to their social standing. At the bar, none of this applies. Homer, Lenny, Carl, and Barney sit at the same stools, regardless of their respective economic positions. Carl Carlson is, canonically, considerably better educated than Homer. He has a master's degree in nuclear physics, though the show treats this as a recurring joke rather than a consequential fact. The same bar, the same stools, the hierarchy doesn't travel through the door. This is true of actual bars, by the way, and I think the show understood that. The tavern has historically been the place where class boundaries became temporarily porous, where the specific pressures of economic position were suspended in favor of the shared experience of being there, being present, having a drink. The Simpsons inherited this tradition and maintained it carefully. Selma's Choice, Season 4, Episode 13, has a moment where Homer and Marge are arguing about something and Homer deflects by going to the bar. It's played as avoidance, which it is. But it's also Homer going to the one place where the argument doesn't follow him, where he can sit with the particular discomfort of the situation without having to solve it immediately. The bar gives him room. Room is sometimes what you need before you can do anything else. Barney Gumbel's relationship with Moe's is its own study. Barney is the show's most consistently treated character of addiction. His alcoholism is both a sustained joke and occasionally something the show looks at directly. Selma's Choice again, and more explicitly, A Star is Burns, Season 6, Episode 18, where Barney makes a short film about his own drinking that reduces the entire audience to tears. The film is called Pocahontas. It is 4 minutes of Barney's face and the sound of beer. The bar holds Barney the way it holds everyone. Without judgment and without solutions, it just stays open. It lets you be whatever you currently are. That's a form of acceptance that the rest of Springfield can't quite offer. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The Simpsons has been rehearsing its own ending since roughly Season 9. That sounds more dramatic than I mean it. I don't mean the show has been consciously working toward a specific final episode the way a prestige drama maps toward its terminal point. I mean something more diffuse. From the late 1990s onward, the show has periodically produced episodes that function as finales, that do the emotional work of saying goodbye, of looking back, of acknowledging what has passed. And then the show has kept going, and the goodbye has remained unfinished, and another one has appeared a few seasons later. The accumulated effect of this is that The Simpsons now exists in a kind of permanent farewell. It has been ending for so long that the ending has become part of its texture. Behind the Laughter, Season 11, Episode 22, May 21st, 2000, is the first and most explicit example. It's structured as a VH1 behind the music-style documentary about the Simpson family, treating them as real entertainment personalities whose show has seen better days. The tone is retrospective and specifically melancholy in the way those documentaries are. The particular sadness of something once great seen from a slight distance. Homer narrates wistfully about early success. The children are ambivalent. There are fake archival clips and a talking heads format. The episode aired as a regular season episode. The show continued, but Behind the Laughter is doing the work of a farewell to the show's golden age. The writers were acknowledging, affectionately, sadly, with genuine craft, the distance between what the show had been at its peak and what it was in season 11. They were grieving it on behalf of the audience within the show itself. Homer's Enemy, Season 8, Episode 23, May 4th, 1997, is a different kind of goodbye. Frank Grimes has had a genuinely difficult life. He earned everything through sustained effort, lived austerely, worked hard. He joins the nuclear plant and encounters Homer, and simply cannot comprehend how a man of Homer's evident incapacity has a comfortable home, a stable marriage, a decent job, and children who love him. The incompatibility drives Grimes slowly mad. He imitates Homer's recklessness to demonstrate its absurdity. He dies. The episode is widely read as the show examining what would happen if a realistic person entered the cartoon world. That reading is correct and has been confirmed by the writers. But it's also a farewell to something, to the idea that the show's premise survives scrutiny. Frank Grimes is the audience member who notices the show doesn't make realistic sense, and the show's response is to destroy him for noticing. There's real discomfort in that, and the writers wanted the discomfort there. The future episodes are the form of farewell that moves me most. Lisa's Wedding, Season 6, Episode 19, March 19th, 1995, is set in 2010 and imagines Lisa engaged to an Englishman named Hugh. The episode is warm and specific and quietly melancholy in exactly the way that imagined futures can be. It shows Homer getting older, shows what the relationship between father and daughter looks like with years of distance between them, shows what time does to the people you love. It ends with a scene between Homer and Lisa in which Homer says he doesn't want to embarrass her, and Lisa says she'd be proud to have him walk her down the aisle, and then she goes back to her own time and Homer doesn't know what just happened. That's not a comedy ending. That's the show doing something tender and sad about the parent-child relationship, framed as a fantasy because the fantasy is the only way it can be told in this format. And then the reset. Lisa is 8 again. The future didn't happen. The episode was a visit to a possible ending, an imagined goodbye. And then it was over. Bart to the future imagined a different, less warm future. Holidays of Future Past. Season 23, Episode 9, December 11th, 2011, imagined another that is widely considered the most fully realized of the three. That episode won an Emmy. It generated significant fan enthusiasm for being treated as a genuine send-off. The show continued for another 13 seasons. Edna Krabappel's tribute card is the one moment that functions as an unambiguous, non-reversible ending. Marcia Wallace died on October 25th, 2013, and the show chose not to recast. The card at the end of 4 regrettings and a funeral. In loving memory of Edna Krabappel, she made us better people, is the quietest, most final thing the show has ever produced. There's no going back from that one. The goodbye landed and stayed, the others are still ongoing. A lot of people who grew up with The Simpsons in its classic years have complicated feelings about its continuation. The show, by general consensus, has not been what it was at its peak for a considerable time. The endings the writers have written, the imagined futures, the retrospectives, the tribute cards, feel like they would have been enough. The show had earned its conclusion by season 8, or by season 11, or by season 23, depending on your personal threshold. But here's what I think the show's persistent continuation actually reveals, and this is not the usual argument about quality decline. A thing that keeps going past what feels like its natural endpoint is also keeping a promise. The characters are still there. The house is still at 742 Evergreen Terrace. Moe's is still open. Whatever you found in the show is still accessible. The goodbye has been deferred so many times that it has become a kind of faithfulness, a refusal to let the specific place go before everyone who needed it has had the chance to find it. The show has been saying goodbye for 20 years. It is still here. Both of those things are true, and neither cancels the other out. The specific texture of The Simpsons nostalgia is worth one more pass, because it's different from most media nostalgia. Most long-running cultural products that survive long enough to become nostalgic objects either celebrate their past too much or are slightly embarrassed by it. The Simpsons has an unusually honest relationship with its own history. It acknowledges the Golden Age, acknowledges that the Golden Age ended, and then keeps going anyway without pretending that continuation is equivalent to recapture. The seemingly never-ending story. Season 17, Episode 13, is structured as a series of nested stories, each told by a different character, each with their own emotional truth. It's late-period Simpsons attempting the kind of structural complexity that the classic era did so well. The attempt is genuinely interesting, even if the execution is imperfect. The show keeps trying. That's what 20-plus years of saying goodbye and not quite leaving actually looks like. Not a show that has given up. Not a show that thinks it's as good as it was. A show that keeps trying, with full knowledge of its own history and full knowledge of the distance between where it's been and where it currently is. The Phil Hartman situation is worth a mention in the context of things that ended permanently. Hartman voiced Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz, two of the show's most beloved secondary characters. From season 1 until his death in May 1998, both characters disappeared from the show afterward. The decision not to recast them has been confirmed as a deliberate act of respect, made quickly and maintained consistently. Troy McClure's last regular appearance was in season 9. Lionel Hutz appeared until season 8. This created 2 permanent absences in Springfield. Unlike Edna Krabappel, who received an explicit tribute, Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz simply stopped appearing. Their Springfield is still there. The used car lot, the law office, both exist. The characters just don't. The town has gaps in it now that the show has never tried to fill. These absences are part of the show's mythology in a way that doesn't get discussed much, possibly because discussing them requires discussing Hartman's death, which is a hard subject. But they shape Springfield. They're evidence that the show's world is not hermetically sealed from the real world. That what happens to the people who make the show happens to the show itself, permanently and without recourse. The gaps are honest. They're the show's acknowledgement that some things can't be replaced and shouldn't be. The specific quality of nostalgia that suffuses behind the laughter in the future episodes is worth examining more closely, because it's different from simple sentimentality. These episodes don't just look back fondly, they look back with clear eyes. They see the flaws, the inconsistencies, the moments when the show was less than it wanted to be. And they do the emotional work of accepting all of it as part of what the thing is. Behind the laughter is fairly brutal about the show's late period decline. It doesn't pretend the family's golden era lasted forever. It shows the commercial decisions, the creative fatigue, the personal frictions. And then it ends with the family deciding to keep going anyway. Not because they think they can recapture the early period, but because the family, for better or worse, is still the family. This is, I think, a more honest relationship with legacy than most cultural products manage. Most long-running things either pretend they haven't changed, or celebrate their change too strenuously, or collapse into apology for not being what they once were. The Simpsons has, at its best, done something harder. It has looked directly at its own trajectory without looking away, and then continued. The writers who produced Holidays of Future Past in 2011 were writing for an audience that had been watching the show for 22 years. The emotional resonance of that episode depends on 22 years of relationship, on the fact that Lisa and Bart and Maggie are characters you have known since childhood, and that watching them as adults carries specific weight. The episode earns its emotional payload through accumulated investment. That's only possible in a show that has been running for long enough. There's also the question of what it means that the show has outlasted so many of the cultural contexts it originally satirized. The 1990s network television landscape that The Simpsons was initially responding to is completely gone. The cultural moment of Bart mania, the early 1990s when Bart Simpson was a genuine countercultural figure, is historical now. The show has outlasted its own original audience's childhood, outlasted the television formats it was born in, outlasted several different eras of what quality animation means, and it's still there, still at 742 Evergreen Terrace, still saying goodbye. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. The Simpsons has a mythology, not simply a recurring cast in a familiar setting, a genuine, coherent, internally consistent mythology with founding stories, a cosmology, a functional theology, recurring symbolic architecture, and a continuous hidden arc that runs through hundreds of episodes for anyone paying close enough attention. The show has never announced this mythology. It doesn't come up in promotional materials or show commentary or official documentation. The writers built it, buried it inside what presents as a cheerful animated comedy, and trusted that someone would notice. Here's where it begins. Lisa the Iconoclast. Season 7, Episode 16, February 18th, 1996. Lisa is writing a school paper on Springfield's founder, Jebediah Springfield. She is methodical and thorough, as Lisa always is. And she discovers something. Jebediah Springfield was not who the town believes him to be. His real name was Hans Sprungfeld. He was a murderous pirate who attempted to kill George Washington and was proud enough of the attempt to record it in a personal confessional. He was also the inventor of Springfield's most famous motivational saying, "A noble spirit embiggens the smallest man," which he fabricated. The heroic founder of Springfield is an invented figure. The town's origin story is a lie. And here's what makes the episode remarkable beyond the Jebediah revelation. Lisa proves all of this. She has the evidence. She's prepared to tell the town the truth at Springfield Day, the annual celebration of their founding. She stands at the microphone. She looks at the parade, at the genuine joy of people celebrating a history they believe in. And she doesn't say it. She looks at the joy and decides that the true story is less important than the story people need. She keeps the secret. The founding myth remains intact. The parade happens every year. The episode establishes definitively that Springfield was built on a lie, that the character who cares most about truth chose to preserve the lie, and then the show continues forward without revisiting this for the rest of the show's run. The fraud is permanent and acknowledged and set aside. There's a settled quality to it, not resignation exactly, but something like acceptance. Every town has a founding story. The true ones are rarely the useful ones. God is in the show. I say this plainly because it's worth saying plainly. God appears as a recurring character in The Simpsons. Not metaphorically, not as a satirical device, but as a consistent presence with specific visual attributes and a stable characterization. He appears in Homer the Heretic, Season 4, Episode 3, October 8th, 1992, in multiple Treehouse segments in Thank God It's Doomsday, Season 16, Episode 19, May 8th, 2005, and elsewhere. He's always drawn with 5 fingers. Every other character in The Simpsons has 4. This was confirmed as intentional in the show's DVD commentary. It is a visual distinction between the divine and the human, built into the character design at the most fundamental level, maintained consistently across different animation supervisors and different decades of production. God in The Simpsons is benevolent but not omnipotent. He makes mistakes. He has preferences. He is sometimes amused by human behavior and sometimes slightly exasperated by it. When Homer accuses him in Homer the Heretic of staying away from church on purpose, God gets a bit defensive. He says, "Don't push it." This is a coherent theology. Not orthodox, but coherent. A God who is present, engaged, fallible, and ultimately aligned with human flourishing, even when humans are baffling. Someone maintained this characterization across 3 decades without contradiction. That's either a remarkable coincidence or a form of care. Sideshow Bob is the show's most carefully maintained continuity project. Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr. appears in 18 episodes across 35 seasons. Roughly 1 per 2 seasons, sometimes more, sometimes less. Each time with a plan to kill Bart Simpson, each time thwarted. The arc begins in Season 1, Episode 12. Krusty Gets Busted, January 17th, 1990. When Bob frames Krusty the Clown for armed robbery, is exposed by Bart, and goes to prison. The grudge that forms there has been continuously advanced across the entire run of the show. There is an episode, Season 19, Episode 8, Funeral for a Fiend, where Bob's plan involves an elaborate fake death. There are episodes in Italy. There are episodes where Bob forms unexpected alliances. There is Cape Fear, Season 5, Episode 2, which is widely considered one of the finest pieces of comedy the show has produced and which is fundamentally about Bob's sustained devotion to a single violent goal. And in Season 35, a flash-forward episode depicts Bob finally killing Bart. Whether canonically or as imagined future remains productively ambiguous. What matters is the maintenance. Across hundreds of episodes, across dozens of writers, across multiple showrunner generations, someone has kept the Sideshow Bob thread alive. Not as a recurring guest star with unconnected appearances, but as a sustained narrative. A man pursuing a specific revenge against a specific child across 3.5 decades of real time. That is not accidental. Someone has been keeping track. The founding families of Springfield share a set of parallel histories that have never been fully mapped. The Van Houtens, the Flanderses, the Lovejoys, all 3 arrived in Springfield's history in roughly the same era. All 3 have family structures that rhyme with each other in ways that feel designed. All 3 have hidden traumas that surface in specific episodes across multiple seasons. Milhouse's parents' divorce, Ned's childhood suppression, Reverend Lovejoy's gradual spiritual exhaustion. These aren't random character details. They form a pattern, a town's social architecture built by people who were thinking about what kind of place Springfield needed to be. The show also has its real endings, not the imagined future episodes, but the permanent ones. Phil Hartman's death in 1998 meant the retirement of Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz, 2 of the show's most beloved secondary characters. Neither was recast, both were quietly allowed to disappear from Springfield. Marcia Wallace's death retired Edna Krabappel. These absences are permanent marks in the show's mythology, places where the fiction and the real world intersected in a way that couldn't be undone. And then there is 742 Evergreen Terrace. The address has appeared in the first episode and in every subsequent episode that shows the house's exterior. It has never changed. In a show where everything else floats, the geography, the timeline, the continuity, the house number stays fixed. That specific detail is the one thing that doesn't drift. Mythology doesn't require announcement to be real. The Simpsons built its mythological architecture across the show's full run, in the margins of what presents as entertainment. The founding lie, the five-fingered god, the 35-year revenge arc, the permanent absences, the address that never changes. These are load-bearing structures of a world that looks, on its surface, much more casual than it actually is. The writers buried it. They trusted that someone would find it and compare notes. That is exactly the right way to build a mythology. Here's the last thing I want to say about the Springfield mythology, which is about the show's relationship with its own audience as part of that mythology. The Simpsons was, in its classic era, a genuinely shared cultural experience. 30 million viewers watching the same episode on the same night, with no way to pause or rewind, no ability to watch ahead, no algorithm sorting content for individual preferences. Just, the show is on, this is what's on, everyone watches it. That experience is gone now. The show continues on Disney+, where it can be accessed in any order, at any time, by any number of people who may have very different relationships with its history. This has changed the mythology without dissolving it. The shared experience has been replaced by a distributed one. Everyone building their own relationship with Springfield, finding their own entry points, discovering the same episodes across different decades of personal history. The mythology is more individual now, more personal, which is perhaps the final version of what the floating timeline was always building toward. A show that belongs to everyone equally, watched at different times, always available, always at the same address. 742 Evergreen Terrace. The family is still there. There's a final layer to the Springfield mythology that I want to end this section with, which is the show's relationship with its own history as mythology. The Simpsons has been on air long enough that its early seasons are now historical artifacts, not just old television, but cultural objects from a specific era that the people who made them can look back on as a distinct period of their lives. The writers who wrote season 4 were in their 20s and 30s. They're in their 50s and 60s now. Some of them are gone. The show has, in a sense, outlived its own original mythology and begun to generate a second mythology. The mythology of what it was at its best, the golden seasons, the specific episodes that everyone agrees are masterpieces. Cape Fear, Last Exit to Springfield, Homer the Great, Marge versus the Monorail. These have achieved a kind of canonical status within the fan community that is separate from their status as television episodes. They are the founding stories of what The Simpsons is understood to mean at its finest. And the show continues making new episodes that exist in relationship to this second mythology. Aware of the standard, sometimes meeting it, sometimes not, always existing in the shadow of the seasons that people mean when they say, The Simpsons was amazing. That's a strange position for a show to be in, to be compared constantly with its own earlier self, to carry its own golden age as a weight. The show handles this with varying degrees of grace. But the mythology is real. Springfield was built carefully. The golden age was genuine. And the ongoing episodes are, in some sense, additions to a mythological record that started being assembled on December 17th, 1989, and hasn't finished yet. The Springfield Day Parade is something I keep coming back to in the context of the show's mythology. It appears in Lisa the Iconoclast and in several other episodes, and it has a consistent function. It is the moment when Springfield's collective identity is performed publicly. The parade is explicitly about the founding myth, Jebediah Springfield's heroism, the town's virtuous origins. And after Lisa's discovery, it becomes something more interesting. It's a performance that the performers know at some level has a complicated relationship with truth. The show never directly addresses this again, but the parade keeps happening. Springfield keeps celebrating a hero who was a fraud, and the celebration keeps working. People are genuinely moved, genuinely joyful, genuinely connected to each other through the ritual. Lisa watches this and understands something that takes most of us a long time to understand: that the social functions of a story can be real even when the story is not. This is the kind of observation that serious anthropology and sociology and religious studies spend considerable time on. The Simpsons put it in a season 7 episode and then moved on. Burns is interesting here in the context of the show's mythology. Burns is, depending on the episode, variably mortal, apparently immortal, possibly supernatural, occasionally sympathetic, and consistently the show's embodiment of concentrated power. His precise relationship with death and consequence has never been fixed. He has been shot, electrocuted, collapsed, and apparently died on at least 2 occasions, and each time he simply continues. The show has not explained this, it has let it accumulate. The Treehouse segment in which Burns is explicitly the devil, voiced, designed, and acting as the devil, is non-canonical. But it sits in the mythology nonetheless. Once that image exists, it filters every subsequent Burns scene. His apparent indestructibility, his century-spanning presence in Springfield, his relationship with Smithers that reads differently in every era, all of it has a slightly different quality once you've seen the segment where he tries to claim Homer's soul. The show didn't plant that deliberately and then pay it off. It found the resonance the image created and allowed it to exist without resolving it. That's how mythology actually works, not through explicit plotting and payoff, but through accumulated association. Images that sit alongside each other and create meaning through proximity rather than through stated connection. The 5-fingered god, the founding lie, the 35-year revenge, the address that never changes, the bar that never closes, the family that never ages. Springfield was built very carefully by people who were paying very close attention to what they were building. Springfield is still out there, somewhere in America, in a town that could be anywhere. The family at 742 Evergreen Terrace has just finished dinner. Bart is 10, Lisa is 8, Maggie is watching something that nobody else in the room is watching. Homer is settling into the couch with the particular satisfied gravity of a man who has, against considerable odds, made it through another day. Marge is doing the things she does, managing, watching, caring more than anyone around her acknowledges, or probably could. Out the window, Ned Flanders' lawn is still tidier than Homer's. Moe's is still open, probably. The nuclear plant is still running and has passed approximately 300 safety inspections that Homer definitely falsified. The monorail is still broken. Jebediah Springfield's statue is still in the town square, presiding over a history that isn't quite what it appears to be, and nobody is in any hurry to correct it. None of it was accidental. The geography, the timeline, the characters who carry things for decades without announcing it. The mythology buried just deep enough that it rewards attention without demanding it. Here's what I keep thinking about this. A show that runs for 36 years on the premise that nothing resolves is making a claim about something. It's not making the claim that nothing matters. Homer's note to Lisa matters. The photographs arranged over the letters matter. Ned's 2 losses matter. Edna Krabappel's tribute card matters. These things accumulated over decades, and they have genuine weight. The claim the show is making, I think, is that the things worth paying attention to don't resolve. Love doesn't resolve. Family doesn't resolve. The relationship between how you imagined your life and how it turned out, between the bowling alley dream and the power plant reality, doesn't resolve. It just continues every day, and you find the photographs and arrange them over the letters, and you do it for whatever or whoever is yours. Springfield is nowhere, It was built to be nowhere, so it could be everywhere. The family doesn't age because the family is everyone's family, always at the same age as when you need them. The mythology is buried because mythology that announces itself isn't mythology, it's just decoration. Nothing in this show was random. That was always the whole point. The real and the invented sit inside each other throughout the show's history. Real deaths shaped the mythology. Real people built the fictional town. Real writers put genuine grief and genuine love into a cartoon family's storylines. And the genuine grief and love are still in there, available to anyone willing to look. That's what it means that nothing was random. Not that every detail was consciously planned. Some of it was accident, some was constraint, some was the particular alchemy of a room full of smart people who cared about what they were making. But the accumulated effect of all those decisions, planned and accidental alike, is a show that rewards the kind of attention you pay at 1 a.m, lying down, half in it and half somewhere else. The family is still at dinner. The episode is still going. The light at 744 Evergreen Terrace is still on.